In this video, I want to compare the similarities and differences of the Path of Exile franchise to those of the Diablo franchise. There's been a lot of hype around Diablo currently with the technical alpha for Resurrected happening, and a lot of information for Path of Exile 2 has been released recently, and we did a preview on that. So I think this is a good time to really dive into what makes these games great, why people love these two franchises, and really see, like, if you're a player and you had to pick one of these games, which one would you pick? Thankfully, you can play both, but if you had to choose, which one would you pick? Probably the best place to begin, or I feel like the best place to start, would be the discussion around free-to-play versus pay-to-play. Path of Exile is a free-to-play game, and it is one that is considered to be done right. That is to say, it's not pay-to-win. A lot of money does not need to be spent in order to enjoy the game. I myself did a run-through during the Harvest League, which happened last fall. Cost me $0, and I had a blast with the game. So one of the really, really beneficial things about Path of Exile, in my opinion, is the fact that it costs you nothing to try. It might not be the perfect game for you, but you don't have to spend anything to find out. If you talk to anyone who is a fan of Path of Exile about what you need to spend money on, most people will tell you that you either spend money on cosmetics, which is completely optional, obviously, or you spend it on storage space. If you're going to play the game like hardcore, you probably have to spend some money on storage space. This is about $10 to $20 depending on how much you buy, which isn't a huge investment because by the time you need storage space, you'll already have spent so much time in the game, you'll probably feel like you should spend some money. Moving over to the other side of the coin is Diablo, which is a pay-to-play experience. All the games are pay-to-play. You buy the game, then you play, which is typical of video games these days, even though more are going free-to-play. And I feel like what comes with that is a certain expectation of higher quality, and people have a certain standard that they're looking for when they're going to spend, $40, $50, $60 on a game. They have these expectations, and if those are not met, then they're disappointed and the game is not good. What's getting harder and harder to do is determine the value of a game. How many gameplay hours do you need to get for the money? What's a $20 game? What's a $30 game? What's a $60 game? How much quality versus how much time played? Is time played more important, or is the quality of the game more important, or where's the fine balance between the two? This is getting harder and harder to define. I think this was a lot clearer 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but now it's like games have raised the bar. Games are longer and longer, and how do you justify spending $60 on a game, and how good would a game have to be in order to buy it? And this is one of the problems that Diablo 4 faces. Diablo 4 has the problem that it has certain expectations. It's going to be a full-priced game. How much is that worth to you? What is it? What needs to be good about that game in order for it to be worth $60? How many hours do you need to get out of it? How enjoyable do those hours need to be? I mean, if you can get 100 hours, do they need to be perfectly enjoyable hours? Or if you got 50 hours, but they were more fun hours, what's more worth to you? And that is a very personal question, and it's very hard to answer for most people. Generally speaking, I am not a fan of free-to-play games. In my experience, most free-to-play games, or the vast majority of them, are designed in a way in order to make more money off you than you would have spent if you would have just bought the game in the first place. However, Path of Exile has done this so well, and this is not the case with that game. Because they have done it so well, and they have made a game of very, very high quality, one that's continually gotten better over the years, I feel like they have a bit of an edge here, because there's no barrier for anyone to play Path of Exile. It doesn't matter what your financial situation is, you can play Path of Exile with Path of Exile 2, and you can start playing, and you can really enjoy that experience, and it costs you nothing. The next thing I want to talk about when comparing these two games is frequent content updates. How much content is added after the release of the game? How much is added in order to keep you playing? What's been added? And just take a look at the differences between Path of Exile and Diablo and what they've done since the launch of these games in order to retain their player base. Let's start with Path of Exile first. And when you're talking about Path of Exile, what they have done is they have these things called leagues. Essentially what leagues are is every 3 months they'll come out with a new league that has its own set of rules, that's on its own server, that it has the same rules as the game, but it's got added rules on top of that sort of change the experience of the game. It's a really clever way to keep things fresh, and leagues add new items to the game. They add new build variety by making things possible that weren't possible before, and it makes players play in a little bit different way when they're done. And what's really great about leagues as well is that when they end, the character that you're playing with just gets ported over to the standard server or the standard league, so that character never gets deleted or anything like that. You can keep playing it all you want, but once that league ends, you're going to move on to the next league with a fresh character. The pros of this are obviously that the game gets frequent updates. It's updated every 3 months. There's a new league like clockwork. You can always expect new stuff to come with Path of Exile every 3 months. And games like this really, really need that to keep their player base retained. And Path of Exile probably does this as good or better than just about any other game in the business. The downside to this is that if you're a player who likes to play one character or maybe two characters, and you just want to play those characters and you want to get them, maxed out, perfected, or try new things with them, but just keep working on those two characters, which some people like to do. I'm very much that kind of person. I mean, I like to play other characters as well, but I think I lean a little bit more that way. If anything, the downside is that you miss out on those leagues, or you have to start new characters every time you're playing those leagues, which you may not want to do if that's not your cup of tea. The Diablo franchise has historically added expansions, a year or two after launch, or even longer, that add like a whole new class or classes to the game, as well as a new act to the game, extending the life of the game with more content. But that doesn't usually happen very quickly after the launch of the game, so if you burn through the game quickly, there may not be a lot for you left to do. Obviously, there are going to be endgame activities in Diablo 4, and there are now endgame activities in Diablo 3 in the form of rifts. So there are things for you to do in between these. But Diablo 3 has not released a new expansion in some time. I don't expect them to release another one. So it's hard to say exactly what sort of frequency the content of these things gets added. However, Diablo 3 does have something that's called seasons, which act much like ladders from Diablo 2, where every 3 months or so, players can create a new character or take one of their existing characters, reset it to level 1, and play through the game again, and try and get on a leaderboard of sorts that, gives special rewards and things like this. It has its own achievements. But in a sense, it doesn't really have a separate set of rules the way that the leagues from Path of Exile do. So you're not going to be playing with new mechanics necessarily. You're just going to be playing through the game again to get, different rewards. So I think in that sense, Path of Exile has a bit of an edge, because if you're going to play seasons in Diablo, you're basically playing the same thing that you played last season, but you're going to get new rewards, whereas in Path of Exile, you're playing the same thing, but different with fresh mechanics. Maybe these mechanics are better, maybe they're worse. I mean, there is that downside. Potentially, you don't like it as much as the last league, and Diablo has that consistency. So if you like Diablo for what it is, and you just want to, play in each season, you can, and you don't have to worry about, will this season be worse than the last season or better, isn't necessarily as much of an issue. The next thing I want to talk about is the end game and how they work for these two franchises, Path of Exile and Diablo. I'll start with Path of Exile first here, and the system they have is called maps. This effectively lets you create a dungeon that has different modifiers and different difficulties that you can go into and kill enemies in order to gain loot and better loot for your character and better rewards, etc. So you're going to kind of customize it, create it, go in, and then do this and get all this stuff. Diablo 3 has rifts, as I mentioned before. Diablo 2 doesn't have anything, and Diablo 4 is going to have dungeons. And these all kind of work similarly. It's a similar concept. You go into it, you kill a bunch of enemies and a boss, and you get rewards, and you can sort of add modifiers that change the difficulties of these things. And you get special rewards or special loot. Rifts, you get specific gems, if I remember correctly, that you can socket that have, their own unique abilities. I don't know what else they've added recently because I haven't played in a little while. But the idea is kind of similar between these two franchises. You create these maps you go into, or create these instances you go into, kill enemies and bosses, and gain loot and better rewards. So in that way, I think, neither game really has an edge unless you're playing Diablo 2, which doesn't really have anything like this. So those of you playing the remaster, unfortunately, you can't expect anything like that was not added to the game. Maybe they will add some sort of expansion that adds something like that down the road. I don't know if that's a thing they're going to do. But if you're playing Diablo 4 or Path of Exile 2, I think you can expect a very similar type endgame. Another thing I want to take a look at is the mechanics and complications of these games. Path of Exile is a very complicated game for new players. I remember my first run through the game, I was doing it on Twitch, and people were like, you haven't read any guides. They were shocked that I hadn't read any guides from the build of my character, because of the way the passive skill tree is, how big and complicated it is. It's almost expected that you read guides before you play the game. Path of Exile 2 is working to rectify this by simplifying some of their mechanics, but generally speaking, Path of Exile is much more complicated than the Diablo franchise, and it has a bit of a barrier there to understanding the game. If you're a very casual ARPG player, maybe you like to play through a game once or twice, I don't think you're going to have a huge issue with Path of Exile. You could figure it out good enough to get through the game. That's not a problem. But if you're somewhere between the very hardcore and a casual player, somebody who, wants to get into endgame, but isn't a min-maxer, I think that's probably where you're going to struggle with Path of Exile. You're going to have to look up some guides probably and do some research in order to really progress there. Some people like that. Some people don't. I think it's one of the reasons that Path of Exile has such a diehard fan base is because it has enough complication. People like that. Usually complication helps you retain player base because it takes them a long time to figure things out, and that taking time to figure things out keeps them playing. It is a bit of a double-edged sword, as I mentioned, though, because some players, just that it'll be too much for them, and they'll just be like, you know what, I can't get into this. So it has its plus and minuses, but I will say I think it's probably worked out for Path of Exile more than it hasn't, even just by a little bit. Talking about the Diablo franchise, I feel like it's a lot more straightforward in the way that it plays. Of course, there's min-maxing to do at endgame and things like that in their builds, and it has that sort of thing, a lot like Path of Exile. But it has a lot less complication. There isn't a massive passive skill tree that you can make mistakes on. And I feel like if you're a new player to these games or somebody who just reached endgame, you're not going to be as overwhelmed. You're going to be able to figure it out and do things. Maybe you watch a couple guides or whatever, that's fine. But it's not like you need to go watch guides in order to play the game. No one's going to ask you that if you're playing Diablo 3. People may ask you, like what builder you're going for, and if you don't know because you're brand new, it's fine. But you can make your way through the game, at least I feel like till a good point without doing any research whatsoever, and you can usually figure it out on your own. One of the things I think about Diablo 2, actually, that people love about Diablo 2 is it's a lot less true for Diablo 2 than it is for Diablo 3 and probably will be for Diablo 4, because there are so many crafted things that you would never know you could make unless you basically looked at a wiki or you looked at some guides or some websites on what to make. It's a lot more complicated, and it's a lot closer to Path of Exile in terms of not the exact type of complication, but it has more complication in that way because you simply would never figure out all these combinations of runes and rune words on your own. You just wouldn't. You have to go look them up and have a database in order to compare and figure out what your builds are going to be. So I think if you're a Path of Exile player or somebody who likes that complication, you will really like Diablo 2 a lot more than, something like Diablo 3. It's hard to tell with Diablo 4 yet because we haven't gotten the game. That's, kind of how those things pan out. The last thing I want to talk about is classes between the two games. Path of Exile has archetypes that you build upon, and they sort of determine where you begin the passive skill tree. So you might start in certain different sections depending on what class you select. And they have ascendancy classes that allow you to kind of specialize within that class, how you play that class a little bit. So you kind of got it like a specialization class that gives you some passives or some abilities that sort of further, define your character. However, what it doesn't do is tell you what skills to use or what passives to take or anything like that. They're completely separated from the class itself. So if you're somebody who, wants a class to be defined for you, like if you pick a fighter, you want it to feel like a fighter, this might be tough for you because Path of Exile doesn't really hold your hand in that way. It doesn't tell you what skills to use. It might make some early recommendations or whatever. But a lot of the class building in that game is, open-ended, and it's completely separate from the skills. So you can have fighters who use spells, and you can have archers who use spells or whatever, and you can mix and match. I'm not saying that, those are meta builds or whatever, but there's a lot of freedom inside the classes to do whatever you want. Taking a look at Diablo, you have more of fixed classes. If you pick like a paladin or something, you kind of know what you're going to get as a paladin. Like paladins aren't going to play like mages. They're not going to cast these spells and use skills from a necromancer. You're going to have paladin abilities, and you'll always use paladin abilities. So in that way, they're a bit more straightforward in the way they play. There's obviously variations of types of paladins and necromancers you play inside of those, but they don't have the freedom to just use any skill and ability they want. So they're a bit more structured. And if you like structure, then you'll prefer Diablo over Path of Exile. But if you like absolute freedom, maybe in the vein of something like Dark Souls, where you can like pick any class at the beginning, but then go however you want, you'll probably prefer Path of Exile. I think looking over all these things, it's pretty clear to me that Path of Exile has the current edge over Diablo. It not only has no barrier to entry, being free to play, and it's a free to play model that isn't pay to win, which I think people really enjoy, but it also has regular content updates in a higher capacity than Diablo. And Path of Exile 2 is probably going to be a more refined experience with similar type gameplay. I think people who love Path of Exile are really happy about that. They don't want the game to drastically change. They want the same type of gameplay, and they're going to get that in Path of Exile 2. The wild card here for Blizzard is Diablo 4. Is Diablo 4 going to be able to compete? What are they going to do after the launch of Diablo 4? Diablo 2 Resurrected looks phenomenal. They've definitely made some goodwill there, and I think people who play Path of Exile will really, really enjoy Diablo 2. The lack of endgame may, hurt the longevity of it, but for just like a complete experience, they'll probably really, really love it. I think one of the edges, though, that Diablo has over Path of Exile, at least with Diablo 3 and Diablo 4, is couch co-op. The console versions of the game have couch co-op, so you can play with your friends or your family. Path of Exile does not have this, and Path of Exile 2 does not have this. So if you are a huge couch co-op fan, which I am, then, even despite these things, Diablo 3 or Diablo 4 might be the game for you because couch co-op is a ton of fun. What do you guys think? Did I get it right? Has Path of Exile surpassed Diablo for the king of ARPGs? Do you think Diablo 4 and Diablo 2 Resurrected has a chance to elevate Blizzard past that? Or do you think with the announcement of Path of Exile 2 and the way Path of Exile 2 is shaping up, there's just no chance for them to climb over them? Did I get it right? I'm not even necessarily the biggest Path of Exile fan in the world, but I do feel like at the moment they have a leg up. What do you guys think?